So today is Saturday, August the 13th. It's a beautiful day here in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm out and about taking care of a few errands, and while I'm driving, I thought I'd record a few thoughts. So what I want to talk about today is the belief that with just changing out the energy systems, in other words, replacing fossil fuels with wind and solar and other renewables, can solve the predicament that we find ourselves in. And here's why that is not the case, unfortunately. I would love it to be the case. But what lies at the root of every problem that human beings are experiencing with relationship to the environment is growth. It's population growth, it's the growth of the industrial economy, globalization, trade, finance, debt. Everything has grown exponentially and continues to grow exponentially. That is not sustainable. We have a planet that has finite resources, and when any species, whether it's human beings or any other species, grows past the point where the natural systems can regenerate what's being consumed, that is something called overshoot. And human beings have been in overshoot since probably the 1930s or 40s. But it's been accelerating in the last few decades, and it's going to take off even more with the development initiatives by China and other countries, which is understandable. It's sort of the playbook du jour. But unfortunately, it's not just about climate change, and that's what a lot of people fail to understand. Climate change is a huge issue, obviously, and greenhouse gas emissions plays a big part of that. But the feedback loops, when ice melts and white ice turns to water, which is dark and absorbs more heat. When permafrost melts, it lets out methane, and all those things are happening. And obviously, when there's more heating and more warming, and then more gases get released, it creates a positive feedback loop. And unfortunately, we've blown past the ability to stop those self-reinforcing feedback loops. Even if all human beings literally were gone tomorrow morning, the CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are such that we're probably going to at least hit 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, which is obviously a totally different world. So that's really sad, but it's irrelevant. Even if climate change wasn't a problem, all the other problems that are associated with growth are not looked at as significant for our survival and the survival of other life. So let me give you an example. The acidification of the oceans, the significant loss of biodiversity, something crazy like 75% of all insect populations have died off since 1990. I mean, think about that for a second. When you go for a drive, I used to go for a summer drive when I was a kid, you'd come home and you'd have bugs all over the front of your car and your windshield you'd have to clean up. Nowadays, you go for a trip, and if there's even one insect that ends up on your car, it's a surprise. So that's a significant change. You know, all of the habitat that's being squeezed, oil and gas development, other development, mining, there's so many associated impacts that accompany economic growth and industrial activity. And nature is a series of complex, interconnected systems, and you never know when you pull a piece of thread out of the sweater that is nature. You never know exactly what's going to happen. And unfortunately, human activity is pulling a few too many of those things at the same time, and it's happening at such a rate that's never happened before in geological history. You know, everything around us seems normal, and a lot of people believe all we got to do is change out the energy mix and everything will kind of be okay. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So how's it going to play out? I would imagine it's going to be a process over several decades, but things like food production are going to be much more difficult because the pollinators aren't going to be as plentiful. The temperature changes that are going to occur is going to change how and where we can farm. The loss of water sources, which are being rapidly depleted because of agriculture, that's going to cause a lot of transitions. You know, humans are very creative, and there'll be a lot of effort made to overcome some of these changes. But I think in the end, what's likely to happen, which is what normally happens with populations of any species that overshoots the carrying capacity, is there's going to be a significant reduction in the number of humans and the amount of consumption that goes on. just as a normal occurrence that accompanies these types of circumstances. How's that look exactly? I would imagine that in the next 4 decades, which is about between 2050 and 2070, I would imagine the human population is probably going to increase in the next decade up to about 8.4, 8.5 billion. And then it's going to start declining rapidly, probably down into the 4 billion mark by 2060, and probably down to less than 2 billion by the end of the century, if not a lot sooner. And that's going to be a lot of hardship, and it's going to be a tough lesson to learn, and I don't know if it can be averted. And a lot of people refer to this type of talk as being Malthusian or anti-human, and nothing can be further from the truth. The whole reason that I don't want human industrial activity to overshoot the carrying capacity is I don't want there to be suffering of humans or other animals or of all of life. But unfortunately, human beings have this superiority complex, and they feel that they can solve any problem that growth creates. And yeah, Malthus got, there was a stick save that Malthus got, foiled by, which was the discovery of fossil fuel and all of the abundant stored energy that's been allowed life to operate the way that it has. But that's not indefinite, and it's getting harder and harder and costlier to extract. All the easy to get, lower hanging fruit has been gotten, so now the energy mix is going to become more expensive. And for those that think we can replace fossil fuels with renewables, I think only about 30 or 35% of all industrial applications can be electrified. And then on top of that, because of what's called the Jevons paradox, any new supply that comes online, whether it's fossil or whether it's renewable, tends to be consumed. So it doesn't decrease consumption, it just replaces some of what would have been increased fossil usage. So the unfortunate reality is, even if we did have a fighting chance, the only way to make a positive change would be to reduce the aggregate impact of human expansion. And that means lowering the human population as humanely as possible, as quickly as possible. I don't know exactly how that plays out. I'm not suggesting we mass murder people, but through things like encouraging people to have less children, even no children. I know to some people that's unthinkable. But this go forth and multiply concept that was probably a good idea, 3,000-4,000 years ago, it's not such a good idea today. And in terms of the wealthier nations who consume the highest rate, the United States consumes, about, I think it's 4.5 or 5 Earths worth of stuff each year on an average person. So if everybody lived the way people in the United States live, where I live, we'd need 5 Earths to supply what's needed to regenerate. Whereas other people in less developed countries live off far less, maybe 10 or 20 times less than what the average American lives off of. So what we have to do is the wealthier countries have to reduce consumption by 80 to 90%. And just think what that would mean for a second. Imagine driving 90% less. Imagine using 90% less energy to heat your hot water, to heat or cool your home, to the buildings that we go to, stopping all new construction, reducing the economy, and it would absolutely devastate people's lives. I know this is all stuff that's really hard to imagine, but we can't have our cake and eat it too. We can't have a perpetually growing, exponential growing economy and expect nature to just take it. It's just not going to happen. So we have a choice. We can either have short-term prosperity and population boom based on cheap, abundant fossil fuels that are going to run out or get more expensive, which is going to be followed by mass suffering to a scale that we can't even imagine, and a lot of death and destruction, not just of humans, but of a lot of species. Or we can come up with some proactive measures, which, while not pleasant, are way less unpleasant than the alternative. So that's where we are, and I think we're going to keep going and going and going. I don't think there's going to be anything that's going to restrain expansion on any level. There'll be some window dressing. I always like to joke, say it's the way we're approaching these problems is like a morbidly obese patient, and they go to the doctor, And they don't want to stop eating all the bad food because they are used to it and they enjoy it. And they might even be modeling, plus size clothing, so they're making their living because of their weight. And the doctor tells them, hey, if you keep doing this, it's going to cause major problems. You might even die. And the patient replies and says, well, I'm used to doing this. I like doing this. I'm comfortable doing this. Everyone else is doing this, and I make my living doing this. What am I supposed to do? And the doctor says, well, you have to choose. You can either get healthy or you're probably going to die. And so the patient's stuck in this addictive cycle. And so the patient finally goes, okay, I'll tell you what. I know I'm eating 4 pints of Ben & Jerry's every night, which isn't good for me. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll replace the last pint with a low-fat version. And that'll be my effort that I'm going to make. And the doctor looks at the patient and says, hey, that's great. I'm glad you're going to be making that switch. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not going to make a difference because of your other behavior. And that's what I would equate wind and solar and recycling and bringing your own shopping bag. They're all great things to do, and I do them because I want to do as many things as I can do. I also don't eat animal products. I don't fly. I try to drive as little as possible. I do have an electric car, although it does draw grid power. I take all my scraps out to the woods and I scatter them. I only eat, plant matter, so I don't eat any meat or dairy or eggs or cheese or fish. So anyway, I'm trying to do what I can, but anybody who's in this culture, 80 to 90% of what we do is sort of fixed, and we can only really cut off the last little bit. And that's our problem. We're unwilling to address the bulk of the problem. So it's a quandary. I don't think it has any easy solutions, and I think we're going to proceed head first. I kind of liken it to a locomotive, a series of trains that are weighed down, and there's only so much track left until the ravine is coming. And even if you press the brakes full on, there's a point along the way where the weight of the train and the momentum, you can't stop it before it plunges into the ravine. Unfortunately, I think we're already at that point. So that's my take. If you have other thoughts or you disagree, if you're a person who believes that humans have ingenuity and will somehow technically fix this, please tell us why or how. Love to hear it, but those are my thoughts.